Before this year, the most I could have told you about my great-grandparents was maybe their names, and even that was a stretch. Looking into my roots has taken me on a tour of the world that I never could have expected. I found myself connecting people that I've never met and discovering their complex relationships. When looking back into my family history, there were a few things I expected to find. One of those things was Vikings. I know for one that I originated from two Scottish clans, Clan Douglas and Clan Robertson. Douglas on my father's side, and Robertson on my mother's. After some short research, I was surprised to discover that these Scottish clans engaged more in the protection and settling of farmland rather than pillaging villages. But what didn't surprise me was the discovery of my Norwegian roots, the more traditional Nordic Viking. And while I wasn't able to explore back into the Viking ages in my family, I did manage to discover a thriving family in the farmlands of Norway. Since running away at age 16, my grandfather Lars has loved to travel. Even in his later years, he would go at the expense of losing time with his family. He always yearned to be in the sky. His first venture took place when he joined a boat. My papa told me of how he was washed overboard during a terrible storm in the Bay of Bisque, and the rain was so heavy that you couldn't even see a foot in front of you. The wind was constantly rocking the boat back and forth, until suddenly he was washed into the cold, unruly waters. However, before he knew it, his body was once again hitting the deck as he was washed back on boards. After doing some research, it turns out that phenomenon isn't uncommon in that area, as merchant ships are commonly, even now, blown over in terrible storms. I decided to take a break from sailing afterwards to join the war as a radio officer. He continued to work after retiring from the army on airplanes as a radio officer, later being upgraded to a navigator. He continued to work for planes for many years, including through the times that he had his 3 children, Johan, or John, my grandfather, Greta, and Sverre. In 1953, Jeannie, Lars's wife, Lars, Greta, and Sverre all moved to Rio. Nobody knows how long they were there, just that Johan was with them. He was left behind to live with Jeannie's sister, who was infertile, in the United Kingdom. Pictured is the house that I am most familiar with my grandparents living in, as my mother and my grandparents lived there as well. This was in the same town that I imagined they would have reunited. And coincidentally, my mother also had another set of grandparents living nearby. Their names were George and Georgina Robertson. After hearing the similarity in their names, I had little doubt in my mind that these people weren't soulmates. George was a saxophonist and a clarinet player, and Georgina was a dancer. They met one night at a dance swing club when George and his band had a gig. Some of my earliest memories of spending time at my papa's house involved finding random instruments in his closets that no one knew how to play. I've always thought that's what inspired me to get involved in music. Really, it was George. Those were his instruments, inadvertently warming their ways into my hearts. Their relationship reminds me that between me and my sister, the musician and the dancer, 2 people that may not always get along, yield from the same world of the arts. Another trait that I believe that I inherited from the 2 of them is my love to travel. These people loved to travel, taking caravans all across Europe. Once, I remember my mother described a trip that they took all the way down to Spain. It was all really profound to find myself connecting with people I had barely heard of. After all, I'd only ever heard of one of my great-grandparents, the one I was able to meet, the one that never strayed far from her home. When we live our lives, we are affected by and affect so many different people in the world. And that's what I wanted to look at when I looked into Laura's history. And what I found was a legacy of strength and community. Tell me about how your gran lived her life.
So my gran lived to a very old age. She lived to like 102. And so when I was very young, she was very old. So she lived in a very kind of small house with my grandfather at the time. And everything was very kind of consistent. So what I mean by that is that she didn't have much kind of change going on in her life. She had, you know, a set of friends around her that she'd known for decades. She lived in a small cul-de-sac, which is a street with no exit, and she knew everybody on the street. And so, you know, she managed to live for years and years, you know, very happy. I mean, she would do her crosswords, she would watch the same programs on TV, and I believe it was that consistency and contentness with what was going on around her that led her to live such a long life.
And then what kind of legacy did she leave behind?
Well, you know, before I was born and my grandmother was working, she worked as a school teacher in the town which we all grew up in, and we pretty much stayed in the same town for her entire life. She was the well known as a school teacher. So what that meant for me growing up, and whenever I would go to like the local dentist or somebody nearer to my father's age, they would all know my grandmother for being a math teacher at the local school. So they all had quite a lot of respect for her because she was quite a strict teacher. And back in those days, pupils had a lot of respect for their elders, probably more so than they do now, and it's specifically their school teachers as well. And so I grew up in that community of all people my parents' age knowing who my grandmother was, and my grandfather for that matter as well. I mean, he was an important part of the community, being the head of the post office in that small town that we grew up in.
Looking into my family history has made me realize how strong the bonds between family can be. Families can be pulled together and created by love and compassion. Families can overcome harsh realities and claim forgiveness. Family is who carries on your memory and your legacy. I can only hope that my life is as full of love, forgiveness, and memory as those who came before me. So you have this family name that's kind of brought down throughout your family. My grandfather, your dad's middle name is Rhodes. I know I have a cousin with the middle name Rhodes. Do you know where that middle name comes from?
I don't actually, but yeah, you're quite right. It's something that has been attributed to the kind of the male side of my family. So, it got handed down from my grandfather to his son, my father. And I've got a family of girls, so I don't get to kind of carry on that tradition at this time. That comes from, I'm not sure.
So I actually found out during my research where that name comes from. Might be your great-great-grandmother married a man named Samuel Morton, and he had the last name Morton, and they had, I believe it was 2 children together, and then he passed away at 36. And she remarried a man who I don't remember the first name of, but his last name was Rhodes. And so then one of her children went on to have a son, and they named him Rhodes after their second father.
That's interesting. That's good. Yeah, because it also coincides with an island in Greece, I believe. So I kind of vaguely thought it had something to do with Greece, but yeah.
He might have been Greek.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you.